Okay, presenters, are you all still there?
Hey, Patty, we're seeing your Outlook right now. Can you show the presentation?
Yeah, hold on.
Cool. So long as it's...
Are you seeing it now?
Yeah, can you go into presentation mode?
Yep.
There we go.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. So, sorry, folks that are joining us. This is Patty Slusher with America's Newspapers. I'm the program director, and I want to welcome you to our webinar today. I apologize that we're getting a little bit of a late start. We do have, no exaggeration, hundreds of people on the call today. So thank you for your patience. We're going to get started here in just a couple minutes. Before we do, I want to give you a couple of very important housekeeping items. Number one, you will get a copy of the PowerPoint that you are going to see today. Not only will you get that, but currently we are uploading several additional resources, documents to our website that you will also have access to that should provide some helpful information for you. So be sure to, we'll send out a note regarding that, but if you just go to newspapers.org, you'll see some of that information. So the PowerPoint and additional information. Additionally, we are recording this webinar, and so you will have access to that. We will send you a link to that recording that should also be helpful to you. So lastly, you all know that you are muted on the call, of course, but we do want to make sure that you ask questions, and I know that our presenters are happy to provide answers as best as we can in the time that we have allowed. So type your questions into the Q&A platform, and we'll be happy to get to those at the end of the webinar. So right now, I'd like to introduce Dean Ridings. Dean Ridings is the CEO of America's Newspapers, and I think he just has a nice welcome for you. Dean, are you there?
I am. Good morning and welcome to our webinar. America's Newspapers is committed to providing the industry with relevant communication and training. Visit newspapers.org for information on future webinars on how to deal with the impacts of this pandemic and other important topics. I'd like to say a big thank you to Camille Olson and the attorneys from Seyfarth Shaw for presenting this webinar for us today. Our presenters are Brent Clark, co-chair of Seyfarth Shaw's Workplace Safety and Environmental Group, James Curtis, who assists clients dealing with all types of occupational safety and health issues, and Ellen McLaughlin, who is engaged in a broad-based employment law practice. This is an important topic that is affecting all of us, and I certainly value the support from Seyfarth Shaw. So let's get started.
Thank you, Dean.
Wonderful.
Okay, Brent, are you going to lead us off?
I am. Patty, can you hear me okay?
I can. Thank you.
All right. Wonderful. Well, welcome, everybody. Thank you, Dean. Thank you, Patty. We here at Seyfarth are very pleased, to be able to share some information regarding coronavirus or COVID-19. Both Ellen and Jim, who joined me today, are and have been members of our task force since it was formed at the outside of this issue. And we've been through previous infectious diseases like H1N1, SARS, etc., Ebola. So we not only have the context of COVID-19, but we have dealt with these issues previously, and there are a lot of similarities from a legal perspective. Our hope today is to make this as practical as we can for you folks, and provide as much practical information as you can. And as Patty said, there will be additional resources available to you at newspapers.org. So I'm going to jump right in. I'm going to give you a little bit of background regarding coronavirus and some preliminary legal issues. Ellen will be discussing a wide variety of employment-related issues, and Jim will be adding in on some very specific workplace safety and health issues. OSHA issued its own guidance just a couple days ago. So you're going to be kind of on the cutting edge of a lot of information. As many of you know, and Patty, obviously you can move on from the legal disclaimer slide if you don't mind.
Oh, okay. Hold on just a second, guys. There we go.
No problem.
Sorry.
There we go. And if you could just scroll through to slide, I think it's 8, that's coronavirus COVID-19. Wonderful. So I'm not going to cover everything because you are going to have the slides to go back to, but one of the cornerstones, as we all know by this point, because this has become so widely known, is that this is an infection. It's a virus that is created through close contact, through coughing and sneezing, and like a lot of viruses, also can be transmitted through surfaces, although that's much more limited. The key symptoms to this, and that's some of your practical as well precautions that you're supposed to be taking. We've all heard fever, cough, shortness of breath. This is fundamentally a respiratory infection. It goes into the lungs, and so the shortness of breath is a little bit of a more unique aspect of this than you might have with a typical flu, influenza. And that's one of the differentiators that the doctors are using. We don't really know what the fatality rate is because it is believed to be, at the moment, according to the CDC, and this evolves literally moment by moment, about twice as fatal as the flu. The elderly are particularly at risk, and individuals with compromised immune systems. Surprisingly, and frankly, one of the better sides of this is the early information is suggesting young folks, especially those under 18, are largely unaffected by the virus if they're otherwise healthy. So that is very good news, and that's very different from the flu. The flu ravages everybody all the way through. The current incubation period is 2 to 14 days, but there was a study by Johns Hopkins that just came out this week that suggests most people will become symptomatic at 5.1 days. That's good. You've seen in the news, 14 days, 12 days, and that was one of the more concerning aspects of this particular virus, because you might have it, not know it, and be infectious. And of course, the longer that occurs, the more dangerous it can be from a public transmission perspective. But as they study this, and they're literally studying it every day, the data is bringing down those numbers, and that will have an effect on the workforce, and it will have an effect in the community as they tighten up that day. Again, it is believed and understood to be most infectious when the person is symptomatic, when they have the fever, the cough, the shortness of breath, so on and so forth. A vaccination, they think they're going to have a vaccination actually in about 6 weeks, but all that means is that's when they start testing the vaccine, and it likely will be another year or longer before we have a vaccine. Patty, if you could give me my next slide, that would be great. Okay, great. So what are the tips for the workforce that we are recommending and recommend for you folks? Anyone who has symptoms, they should stay home and they should contact their doctor. And of course, the healthcare system is ramping up for all of this. If employees become symptomatic or show symptoms at work, you should send them home, because until we figure this out, that is the best practice. Everyone needs to practice good hygiene. You've probably heard this all over the news, but it can't be stressed enough. This is the primary way that we can control the spread of this and prevent ourselves from getting it. If you're symptomatic, cover your cough. Avoid touching your eyes, your nose, and your mouth. Believe it or not, the statistics show we do that tens of times an hour. So you got to really try to fight the way you've been brought up, but at a minimum, wash your hands after you've touched surfaces and clean surfaces as much as you can. Face masks has been a big issue. Many folks have been asking us, can we wear the surgical mask? We see folks wearing on TV, that kind of stuff. The CDC's answers to that is pretty plain, is they do not recommend that anyone who's well wear a face mask. The face mask is actually indicated for someone who is symptomatic, because that's to prevent you from spreading these airborne droplets. So face masks are, for the general workforce, for you folks, generally not a good idea, and frankly, they may provide a false sense of security.
And we do see lots of our clients have asked us, they're getting requests from employees. Can I wear a face mask? Should I be wearing a face mask? And as Brent indicates, the first step in responding to that is educating the employees on this, because there's a lot of panic out there. And I think a lot of the workforce doesn't understand that the face mask is really, as Brent said, and as the CDC has said, is for ill people, not for well people. So educating the workforce is key.
Exactly, and thank you, Jim. And I should emphasize the CDC website, then the WHO website are incredible sources of information, but you can be looking at the CDC website. It's structured so it answers your questions, so on and so forth. But it's there's a lot of misinformation about the wearing of face masks. If someone should approach you with a more question about a filtering face piece respirator, that's a technical kind of OSHA thing, we encourage you to reach out and get some advice on that, because you can't just let people wear even a dust mask that you might get from Home Depot at work without following some OSHA regs. And again, so you're going to need some specific advice if you get that. The last thing on this slide real quick is about the social distancing, which I'm sure you've heard about, but the key here is 6 feet. And again, this is a nice objective rule of thumb that you can begin. If you're in the same building somewhere in the United States as somebody else who has the virus, that's not considered in close contact with under the CDC guidelines. Generally speaking, the early studies are indicating people within a 6-foot zone might get an air droplet if it were present, and outside that will not be exposed. OSHA in its guidance uses 6 feet, and that was just adopted by the federal government this week. Patty, if we could go to the next slide.
Yeah, there's just kind of a delay. Hold on. I don't know why.
No worries. No worries.
There we go.
There we go. And folks, you have this. I'm not going to go over this data. This changes literally, every couple of hours, but from a macro perspective. But again, it has now been confirmed and as a global as a pandemic. Patty, next slide, please.
Brent, could I stop you just for a second? I do have somebody that, this is, I'm sorry, in reference to like 2 slides ago when you were talking about the flu. If you could address that, this person is saying that we've been told it is 10 times worse than the flu. Do you want to address that statement?
Yeah, sure. And there are there are some folks who have said that. It was based on some early data. And one of the things about the mortality rate of a virus like this is the denominator, what we call the denominator. As you can imagine, as we get more and more cases of people with coronavirus who generally within 5 to 6 days recover from their symptoms and come out the other end as healthy individuals. As the denominator of people who have been exposed and confirmed as COVID patients increases, the fatality rate decreases. And so the statistics have been driving down as we get more and more data on this. So the best information we have from the folks that we're following is that they think it's going to sort out about twice as a fatality rate, about twice as high as the flu. Some real quick facts of the flu, since we had a question. We're over 30,000 deaths in the United States on the flu right now in this flu season. That is, it tops out typically in a given year at 60 or 65,000. And so while the COVID-19 obviously is serious, and that, I should go back, that fatality rate is concentrated in the elderly, and the risk goes up almost exponentially in 10-year increments from 60 to 70, 70 to 80, 80 to 90. The average age of the folks in Italy who have perished from the COVID-19 right now is 81 years old. So as the data comes out, it is particularly dangerous to folks who are older because they tend to have more compromised immune systems and just not as capable to fight it off. Okay.
Great, thank you, Brent. Appreciate the clarification.
You're very welcome. You want to hit the next slide for me?
I don't know why there's such a delay. I'm sorry.
No problem. Well, I'll just comment. One of the things people should keep in mind is the difference between the number of cases in the United States and the number of cases worldwide. I mean, we are obviously sitting on a very, very small fraction of the cases, thankfully, at this point in time. So the global statistics are not particularly relevant for a workplace and a workforce in the United States at the moment. The U.S. statistics are way more informative. So again, these are the slides in front of you. These are just some of the steps that the government has taken. The one I'll stop on for just a second is this week, as everyone knows, the administration announced a 30-day ban on all travel to the U.S. from Europe. And that's because the virus was perceived to be coming uncontrolled within the European community. And then everyone knows with the news today how schools, sports organizations, colleges, lots and lots of folks shutting down as part of efforts to control the spread. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Ellen, and if you could bop forward to the next slide, and I'll let Ellen run it from here.
Good morning, everyone. I wanted to address with you some of the common questions that we have been getting from clients as to what they can and cannot do, as well as if someone is a known tested positive case for COVID-19, has symptoms, needs to be self-quarantined, and how you deal with that. So if you'd advance the slide, Patty, that would be appreciated.
Okay.
Let's talk about really what ends up being, frankly, the easiest to deal with, which is FMLA. So does the FMLA apply to an eligible employee, right? Worked for you for 12 months, 1,250 hours in the last year at a work site, right, with 50 or more employees within a 75-mile radius, you still have to be eligible, who has COVID-19 or who is caring for an eligible family member, a parent, spouse, or child who has COVID-19? The simple answer is almost always that's going to be a yes, that I cannot, frankly, imagine that COVID-19 would not be a serious health condition as defined under FMLA. So what do you do then? You follow your normal FMLA process. I don't think we should be throwing out our normal processes here as a result of this, but realize that when you ask for the medical certification or verification that the individual has COVID-19, that because the healthcare system is becoming a bit overwhelmed, the receipt of that medical certification on a timely basis might be a bit delayed, even though your employee is making diligent good faith efforts to get it back to you. What about the question as to whether or not FMLA applies to an eligible employee who has symptoms, but who is caring for an eligible family member who has symptoms, but there is no positive COVID-19 diagnosis? Well, here's what you do. You follow your normal FMLA analysis. And if it's simply symptoms, you know, a dry cough, runny nose, but that's kind of about it. That's not going to be FMLA. It's not going to be a serious health condition. But if you are following your normal FMLA process, you might see that perhaps it might be FMLA if the individual is incapacitated for more than 3 consecutive calendar days and has either gotten treatment from a healthcare provider 2 times or has gotten treatment from a healthcare provider 1 time but gets a course of prescription drugs, right? So all of that should be pretty familiar to you. But that's going to be like, listen, that's going to be maybe an upper respiratory issue that has no relationship to COVID-19 at all, but simply asymptomatic, they are sent home. It's not FMLA. Next slide, please. So let's talk about the FMLA and whether it might apply to somebody who is self-quarantining, which is kind of the example I just gave. You follow the normal FMLA analysis. Most typically, the answer would be no, because we have no diagnosis of a serious health condition, and we don't even have any symptoms here if they are self-quarantining. So FMLA wouldn't apply. I have had some questions from clients to say, well, why wouldn't I just say it's FMLA, right? Because that does get your employee job protection, probably gives them some comfort. But here's the issue. You know, let's hope, knock on wood here, that within 6 months, right, we're through this. And if you have designated an individual's leave as FMLA, and it really shouldn't have been, and they then want to take FMLA in the future here, they are going to say, well, you know what? Now that this is over, I was self-quarantined. I had no symptoms. This shouldn't have been FMLA. That was just wrong. And I should have that time back in my FMLA bank. So just follow your normal analysis under FMLA. So as I said, that's kind of the easy one here. You should also look, because we have laws and benefits coming online, it seems like daily, but there may be, right, for in terms of benefits or the requirement for time off, you should look at whether there is a state family and medical leave law that might be an issue here, whether there's paid state family and medical leave laws, so paid or unpaid. Are there local or state paid sick leave laws that might be an issue here in terms of payment, more so than the ability to give somebody time off? So just, you know, as you know, things are coming online daily, so just keep, for that, your eyes and your ears open. Let's go to the one that's a little more difficult, which is how do we address keeping the workplace safe, knowing what to ask employees, and not running afoul of the Americans with Disabilities Act. So remember, of course, that, you know, the definition under the ADA is that the law protects a qualified individual with a disability. And we may jump to the conclusion that COVID-19 is a disability under the ADA, but that's not perfectly clear, to be honest. So, of course, if we have a physical impairment that substantially limits, right, a major bodily function, here I would argue it might be musculoskeletal with the body aches and that kind of thing, respiratory, okay, but the COVID-19 oftentimes is something that is of short-term duration, and those aren't disabilities. So it's not perfectly clear that COVID-19 would be a disability. What could happen, though, is that an employee may develop a disability from the coronavirus, or it may aggravate a pre-existing disability. So you kind of just need to factor that in when trying to analyze whether the law attaches. Of course, if it does, that employee is going to be entitled to reasonable accommodation, provided it does not cause an undue hardship or direct threat to the health and safety of themselves, which of course here is pretty prevalent, or to the health and safety of others. Let's just kind of tick through what we're seeing in terms of possible accommodations. And sometimes, even if it's not ADA, right, it's a solution, right? Even if we say, okay, well, this isn't a disability, but it's a solution rather than an accommodation. Of course, work from home is what you are hearing about on a regular basis. Now, of course, the issue with that, especially in your industry, is, well, there are certain people that they just cannot do their jobs at home. And how might we work with that? And, these are just tips that we're picking up from other employers. Some employers are going to split schedules. So there are less, I'll call them essential employees who need to be at work on site. It might not be everybody in at the same time. So there are fewer people on site at the same time. In the pharma industry, for example, what they are doing is they have, many of them, sent their non-essential employees home to work from home. Their essential employees, like a scientist or production employees to keep drugs being produced, they are still being required to come to work. But the theory here is the fewer individuals in the workplace, the better for those essential employees, right? Because they are going to be exposed to less people. So get the non-essential individuals out of the workplace and keep the essential employees with fewer contact with individuals generally. What else do you have to worry about with telecommuting? Well, there are a number of states that actually require employees to reimburse expenses for those who are now working from home. And so you should check to see if you are requiring employees to now work from home, whether or not you are in a state that requires reimbursement of those. Could be an additional internet charge. In some states, you have to actually assist employees, it's part of the accommodation, to set up their home office because they may not have the equipment that is necessary for them to work from home. So we have some reimbursement issues that you need to address as well, both under state law, and there are some federal wage and hour laws that might be implicated. So we have working from home as an accommodation. We have putting somebody on leave. We have them coming back on a reduced schedule. We have, okay, you don't have to travel during this time. What I would suggest is documenting, whether it's called an accommodation or assistance, that you are allowing individuals to work from home or some other accommodation because of the exigent circumstances that we are dealing with now. It seems kind of harsh to say, okay, well, we're only doing this because. But again, we're thinking to the future to say, Well, 6 months from now, if that individual says, well, hey, I want to work from home and I have this disabling condition, I need to do that, we still want to be able to say, well, you know what? That really does create an undue hardship for us. We need you in the office because of the supervision that's needed for your job, or you're a supervisor and you need to be meeting with people face to face. So we want to be able to say this was an exception to the rule. It's not creating any precedent that necessarily working from home is something that's easy for us to do. So think about the documentation related to working from home, or really any of these likely accommodations. Next slide, please. So the next one is, we have been getting, I cannot tell you how many questions,
Yeah.
right, about what can you ask your employees. And this has shifted now. Once the World Health Organization declared this a pandemic, there are many more questions that you can ask employees that are no longer said to be disability-related inquiries. And the very last slide, you will see a web address for the EEOC's guidance on pandemics, which is very helpful to a certain extent. The problem is that relates to the H1N1 pandemic. So it's like, what happens before it's a pandemic? What happens after in terms of what employers can do? The bit of a problem is it hasn't been updated for COVID-19. So some of the language in there is a little tortured, and we're still trying to figure out kind of how it fits in here, but it is a good resource. So what can you ask? Have you been diagnosed with COVID-19? Now, some will say, well, for goodness sake, you would hope that anybody who's been diagnosed is coming forward and saying, I can't come into work, but can you ask that question? Yes, you can. Do you have any of the following symptoms? And you list the symptoms and you ask employees to tell you if they have any symptoms. I would note here that the CDC symptoms that are articulated in their materials versus the World Health Organization are a bit different. So I looked at an employer's form the other day and it was listing things like runny nose. And I'm like, that's not a symptom that CDC points to, but it is one that the World Health Organization points to. So it's a lot of symptoms that you can ask individuals about. Have you traveled to a level 2 or 3 country, and when? I think generally we're suggesting that if the time period is in the last 14 days. This one's a little more difficult, I think. Have you traveled to a state where there has been a declared state of emergency, and when? Or it could be even more particular. Have you traveled to an area, you know, like Westchester County in New York, right, where, you know, they're undergoing containment there, and when? I think those are all free game. I would strongly suggest that when we're getting into states of emergency and the prevalence in a local area, that you pick up the phone and get information from your state or local health department as to really what they're saying at the point in time. Contact. Have you had contact with anyone who has had COVID-19, and when? Absolutely a question that you can ask. Now, you ask those questions, and what do you do when you have that information, right? Well, then, of course, it's options. Do you send the employee home? Well, certainly if they're having symptoms or they have been caring for somebody who has symptoms, COVID-19, listen, we are erring on the side of maintaining the safe workplace, sending people home, and most often they are happy to go home. Their worry is the paycheck, right, which I'm going to get to in a minute. You have to keep any medical information that you might get from them confidential, and this is one that gets kind of lost a little bit. Make sure you're treating employees consistently. So, for example, if you have an executive who has traveled overseas and tells you that they've traveled to Japan in the last 14 days, and you're like, oh, that's okay. Like, we need you in the workplace. but yet somebody had some personal travel that is a lower level individual, and you make them leave work because they've traveled to Japan, you need to be treating people consistently. I mean, we still have our regular employment laws going on here, right? Where we want to make sure we're not drawing any discrimination claims as a result of the actions that we're taking. While not employee questions, many, many of our employers are asking very similar questions of visitors. And if any of these questions usually are with some further inquiry, a yes, they are banning those visitors from the workplace. And that's an even easier call to me because that's not implicating the ADA.
And we'll get into that on the OSHA side. That's exactly what OSHA, as well as the CDC, is recommending.
So let's go to the next
Ellen?
slide. Yes.
Ellen, I have a couple questions. I'll go to the next slide, but I have a couple questions that are related. I'll ask both of them, and you can answer them. The first question was, so an employee returns to work after spending 7 days on a cruise, and other employees express concern about their return because they could have the virus and not know it. What do you do? And the next question is also cruise related. Does someone who has been on a cruise ship have greater risk? Question mark. Can we ask if they have been on one recently?
All right, so let me take these in a bit of a different order. So more and more employers are asking individuals if they have been on a cruise ship within the last, again, generally people say 14 days. And then if the answer is yes, let's take it like, what should you do? Do you send them home? Forget about the employee, their coworkers' concerns for a second. Should you, as the employer, send them home? Well, I think you have to do a little more digging. So if it's certainly a cruise ship that has had anybody infected, depends on the location where that cruise ship has been. So until you know some of those answers, I would keep that person out of work. Some employers are, again, erring on the side of like, who knows where that cruise ship has been. They're still in this, petri dish of thousands of people on the cruise ship. I'm going to err on the side of sending that person home. And I don't see how that would be running afoul of the ADA. Some people are concerned about we're perceiving them as being disabled. To be honest, I'll take that claim in the future over maintaining a safe workplace. The question with respect to what if other individuals are concerned because they've heard the person, they know the person went on a cruise, I think you handle it the same way. You may, if your analysis is that you're concerned about the risk of somebody being on the cruise, and maybe, this is bubbled up and you didn't really know they were on one, I think the action would be the same. I'm going to talk about employees who, as a group, a little bit later on for protected concerted activity. But the one question that I need my OSHA colleagues here to answer is, are you at greater risk for COVID-19 if you're on a cruise ship?
Sure. I think the answer is you're only at greater risk of catching COVID-19 on a cruise ship if there is, in fact, COVID-19 on the cruise ship. So if there's no presence of the disease, then frankly, you're safer on the cruise ship than you are moving about the general public, where you're going to come into contact with more people. The problem here is, right, we've had the Princess Cruises, and we've got, the known cases of frankly, entire ships becoming infected. Once the virus gets on the cruise ship, then yes, I think there is a greater likelihood than just kind of milling about your community, because you are now in that restricted area and you're likely to have exposures to the virus as it multiplies throughout the folks on the cruise ship. So it really depends on whether or not there is a virus on the ship and what is known. So as Ellen said, I think you really need to dig a little deeper and find out, was this an Alaskan cruise where it's highly unlikely that we had an issue, or was this a South Asia sort of cruise where there might have been greater problems?
Thanks, Jim.
Good.
So let's go to
Ellen?
Yes?
Ellen, I'm going to present a question to you because you can address it on this slide that we're on right now. The question is there a liability for taking the temperature of visitors and employees as they enter the building would use a non-contact forehead thermometer?
Yes.
And
let me just work through that, Patty.
Yeah,
because
looks like you might be able to address it on.
Exactly. So that probably is the number 2 question we're getting is, can we take employee temperatures as they arrive for work and send them home if they have a fever? And then we'll add on, and if we go ahead and do it, is there a potential liability there? Even if we do it with the scan kind of thing, so we're not sticking a thermometer in people's mouths. So let's talk legal first. Taking an employee's temperature generally is a prohibited medical exam under the ADA. There is an exception if it's considered job-related and consistent with business necessity, which could include the direct threat defense. But that's generally for an industry like healthcare, where we need to make sure our healthcare workers are not coming in with one of the primary symptoms and infecting others. But now that it has been declared a pandemic, this EEOC guidance really flips to different answers. And if you can go to the next slide. So here's what the guidance says. So, and this is where it gets a little like tortured in terms of their language. So if the pandemic influenza symptoms are more severe than the seasonal flu or the H1N1 virus in the spring, summer of 2009, or if that has become widespread in the community, as assessed by state or local health authorities, then it's okay to take people's temperatures. So the second part of that statement, it becomes widespread in the community as assessed by state or local health authorities. Well, that's kind of easy, right? That maybe you just know that about your community, depending on where you are, or you pick up the phone to see if, the local health department is saying it's now widespread. The more difficult one is, well, okay, I don't have that, but it sure seems to me that with the COVID-19 here, the symptoms are more severe than the seasonal flu, right? And the question is, well, how do you measure that? So we've debated that internally, and a number of us have said, well, so hey, at least right now, the death rate from the symptoms is greater, it looks like, right, than from the seasonal flu. So we think that we are now able to take individuals' temperatures. I would say not perfectly clear, but we are certainly leaning that way. Now, having said all that, and I'm going to get to the other laws here, if you look at the bottom of the page, we say, okay, but because a lot of employers are going, I need to take everybody's temperatures, and we're like, okay, let's take a deep breath. Let's think about what that action really gives us in terms of information. Well, even if somebody doesn't have a fever, right, at the time, so it's a negative, they go to work and they do have COVID-19. And the reverse is true, right? They have a fever, but they don't have COVID-19. So do we really want to be engaging in taking people's temperatures? That, I think, is a decision that needs to be well thought out before we have lines of people out the door taking people's temperatures. because we've got other laws that are implicated. So we do have some privacy concerns. HIPAA is not really implicated here because it's not information coming from a healthcare plan, but we do have general privacy concerns. So think about this. Depending on how many employees you have, you line people up to take their temperatures, and then somebody has a temperature and you say, turn around and walk out the door. And then everybody knows that they have a temperature, right? And so is that keeping their medical information confidential? Probably not. So can you do it in an office? One by one would be better, but we have privacy concerns. If you're unionized, it could be, and again, you should check with your labor lawyer, it could be that if you're going to take people's temperatures, that could trigger a duty to bargain about that. There are some exceptions to when you have to engage in a duty to bargain about something like this, but don't forget about that. And then finally, depending upon when you're taking of the temperatures, it could result in compensable time for the people that are waiting in line to get their temperature taken. So we have a lot of other laws that become implicated if the decision is made to take somebody's temperature.
And the CDC is not recommending that course of action.
Yeah.
As an aside.
Thank you. Next slide, Patty.
And just so you guys know, I have several more questions coming up. So maybe after this, we can address some of those too.
Okay.
Sure. Am I on the right slide?
You are. Oh, no, one back.
Okay. Is this
So,
right now?
Exactly. So can you require a return to work note from somebody's healthcare provider who, let's say, was self-quarantined with no indication? I'm sorry, that's the wrong example. Can you still require a return to work note from a healthcare provider where there's been no indication their absence has been tied to COVID-19? Okay. I would stress again, we need to not throw our normal policies out the window. We follow our normal policies. If you normally require a return to work note, if somebody has been out for a number of days or for a particular leave, then you continue to do that, and you do it consistently. But again, be reasonable about the time it might take for somebody to give you that return to work note from their physician because of the potential stress on the healthcare system that's occurring here. How about a return to work note following somebody who has COVID-19, had symptoms but never developed it, or you had required them to self-quarantine due to possible exposure? I think you can require a return to work note from their healthcare provider in any of those circumstances. Apply that consistently across the board. I do have a question for my OSHA colleagues here about fever. And should we specifically ask we want to know how long it has been since you have had a fever before we allow you to return to work. So what's the best practice in terms of being clear from a fever?
I say yes, we ask. Number two, what the latest information is suggesting is that after 2 to 3 days, and it's unclear, of being asymptomatic, you are likely no longer contagious. And so if we follow the normal course that the average person will show symptoms at 5.1 days, they're symptomatic for 4 or 5 days, then there's a couple of days of there. That is why the 14-day quarantine is deemed, the 14-day quarantine is been this week's information on the latest data has supported the 14-day quarantine. But anyway,
Okay.
yeah, sorry, that's
Yep. Okay.
that's the short answer I can give.
Hi guys, can I throw out, just since we're on this subject, a couple questions that are kind of piling up here?
Sure.
So the first, there's two questions. One is they're asking for, and I know this is probably difficult, they're asking for a clear bottom line on taking temperature. And another was, should we check employees for symptoms every day?
So in terms of taking temperatures, I wish I could say absolutely you can do it, or no, you can't do it. Here's what I can say. I think there is a good argument to do it. I think anybody that would say you absolutely cannot do it, I disagree with that. It's a little more nuanced in terms of the ability to do it if you are relying simply on the symptoms being more severe than the influenza or H1N1. If I had push come to shove and I was betting on a table in Vegas, which, probably is shut down now soon, I would say I think you can do it. But there are so many other factors to consider and I don't want anybody to have it be just this kind of knee-jerk reaction. We should take people's temperatures.
Yeah, and from the safety side of the world, this is an exceedingly fluid situation, and we're really at the crest of a wave here, and we're dealing with an issue that doesn't have clear-cut answers because we don't usually go through pandemics. And so this doesn't happen very often, but one of the considerations that we're always giving, not just for temperatures, but for all of the safety issues around this, is where are you geographically? And are you in a community spread area? So the answer as to whether or not it's a good idea to take temperatures is going to be different if your facility is in Seattle than if you're in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. Obviously, one presents, a likelihood that there could be spread to your employees in Seattle, whereas it's highly unlikely that has happened if you're in Escanaba or some other, more populous area, but that hasn't yet seen the community spread. And so we're really saying you need to analyze these issues. And while we'd love to give you clear black and white answers to some of this stuff, it's much more nuanced than that.
And what do you think about the follow-up question, which is, should I be checking, and I'm not quite sure what the checking means, right, employee symptoms on a daily basis?
Yes, so the CDC, and we always, we ground ourselves in the CDC and what the medical professionals are recommending is that, your supervisor should be aware of the signs and symptoms of COVID-19. They're very similar to the flu, but they should be aware of it. And one of the things that we haven't done in the past, because we weren't in a pandemic, is really training our supervisors to, hey, look at your employees. You don't have to line them up as they come in the door like you're taking their temperatures, but, survey the employees that you supervise, yes, on a daily basis. And if you identify someone who is coughing and sneezing or appears to have a fever or is having difficulty breathing, then yes, you should be pulling that employee out from the general population of employees and having that conversation with them. And if they have those symptoms, sending them home.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jen.
Just for another one, and I know many of you are sending me questions, and I'm trying to get to them so that they're relative to the topic we're on. So I'm kind of skipping around a little bit. And on the temperatures again, we are not medically certified, and everyone has a different normal temperature. Should there be a threshold of what constitutes a high temperature?
I'm sure there'd be a
high temperature.
A threshold. Yes, I think the CDC guidance says anything over, it's 100, like 104. Brent, do you know off the top of your head what they talk about?
I don't, Patty. we'll get something to you by this afternoon to put on your site for the folks to answer that one, okay?
Okay, yeah, I saw that information somewhere. I don't know. I thought it was like 100 point something constitutes a freezer, but thank you. All right, we'll
Yeah, I
watch
think it's
for that.
100.4 is,
Yeah.
I believe
Yeah, I
it's
thought
100,
it was
but we want to make sure we get it right.
Yeah, I think Jim is
Okay.
right. It's not 99.
Yeah.
So,
Patty, if you could go to the next slide, because I think some of the questions are likely addressed, I think, by the next slide here and the couple of slides after. So what do you do if you have, no, go back one.
There we go.
And thanks, Patty. We're having a pop-up box appear at least on our computer screen. I don't know if that's at your end.
Oh, yeah, it's not on the general folks, I don't think.
Okay.
But,
All right.
Okay.
Is it the question?
Yeah, so what if you have an employee who fears to come to work and possibly even refuses? Now, right now I'm talking about one employee who comes in and says, this is freaking me out. I just want to stay home, and it's really a job where they need to be at work to perform their job. So are there any ADA implications? Do we need to worry about that at all? If it's simply a fear, which of course lots of people have right now, it's likely not implicating the ADA, but always kind of watch out for, does the person have some underlying mental health condition, an anxiety disorder, where what's going on now in the world and at work is really triggering anxiety. So maybe ADA might be implicated. Do they have some autoimmune disorder where this is a bigger problem for them? ADA might be implicated. And the point there is, well, then the interactive process would be triggered and the duty to accommodate would be triggered. But we try to address their fears, educate them, provide work from home when we can. And listen, the last thing I personally think we want to be doing, unless we absolutely positively have to, is disciplining employees, right, who have a fear of coming to work, balanced against the fact that we still need to be able to run our operations, right? So it is a delicate balance. What if, though, we're going to change it up here, what if you have a number of employees who come in and say, we're refusing to work, and we have this general fear, or, hey, we are standing next to somebody who is coughing their head off all day long, and unless you send that person home, we're going home. Well, as Jim just said, if somebody is coughing their head off, you get them out of the workplace and you send them home. General fear, you need to kind of explore that with the group of people, but understand that when you have groups of people that may be refusing to work, that is triggering the National Labor Relations Act protected concerted activity. And there is an exception. So let's say they just walk out. There is an exception under the Taft-Hartley Act that if they have a reasonable belief based on objective evidence of imminent threat of harm. So that's kind of what you're looking at here. So if it is it the person coughing next to them or some generalized fear, then you can't invoke your no strike clause in your agreement if you're a unionized employer. And you cannot fire or discipline them because they are engaging in protected concerted activity, but you don't have to pay them. Let's hope it never gets to that, but I just did want to highlight that it does change when you have a group of employees who are coming in, voicing their concerns, perhaps walking out or refusing to work. Next slide, Patty. So let's talk about the pay issues for a second. So are you paying people when you're putting them on leave? I mean, you fall back first on your policies. What do your policies say? Is there pay available? What about your bargaining agreement? Do we have funds coming from the state? Do we have federal assistance coming in? All of that is in the works. In the absence of accrued paid time or some statutory pay or CBA pay, an hourly employee is not guaranteed wages. period. That's a tough rub for people that are told to self-quarantine and are not going to be paid. Exempt employees, just remember, again, you fall back on your normal policies here that you cannot do an effect partial day docking for an exempt employee if they've worked any part of the week, and they need to be sent home for the full week. Otherwise, they need to be paid their full salary for that week. So be careful. You don't want to implicate losing your exempt status here. If you're not going to pay your exempt employee who you're sending home, it has to be really on a full week basis. Also make sure they're not doing work while at home, because that, again, could result in a situation where then you're effectively, they're doing some work and you should be paying them for that entire week. And then finally, the next slide is, well, what happens if we have to engage in some furloughs here? Many state unemployment laws, and it looks like the feds are stepping in now, do allow for the provision of unemployment compensation benefits in this setting. That is rapidly changing. The feds are telling the states how to do it so that if you have to furlough people, and it may even be, based on some things I've read, that there is, if you are self-quarantining people, so a 2-week period, not really a furlough, that unemployment benefits may be able to help people who are otherwise not being paid. Jim?
Yes. So Patty, can we slide on to the next slide? We thought we'd bump over here to talk about the OSHA and safety issues. Patty, I know we're a little bit over time here. I don't know that I need to walk through each of these slides, but should we take a little time here to broadly discuss the OSHA issues?
Absolutely, and I still have some additional questions. So we'll stay on as long as we have to, and I'll just remind the folks that are on the call, if you have to jump off, you are going to get these slides, and we are going to send you the recording. But folks, I'm happy to stay on, for however long we have to get these answers taken care of.
Sure, and I'll work through these quickly because I know we're pressing everyone's time. So on March 9th, OSHA got around to issuing their own guidance document on this, called Guidance for Preparing for Workplace COVID-19. This is not an enforcement document. It doesn't indicate what, if any, enforcement activities OSHA is going to take. Thus far, we have not seen OSHA enforcement activity around COVID-19. We don't know if, this is very fluid. We don't necessarily anticipate to see a lot of that right now, but this is more of a practical guidance, and you'll see that it largely aligns with the CDC as to where to go on this. Next slide, Patty. What OSHA is really focusing on here and looking for employers to do is to develop an infectious disease preparedness and response plan, is what they call it. The practical recommendation here is that you need to look at this from an industry-specific, geographic-specific, employer-specific perspective as to what are the hazards in your workplace, what are the kind of jobs in your workplace, what are the types of potential anticipated exposures, and what can you do to control those potential exposures. Next slide, Patty. You'll see here that from an OSHA perspective, what they're recommending is your basic plan should largely align with the CDC guidance on this. Make sure you're communicating with the public health officials. A big part of it is always the basic hygiene measures. Anticipate, all right, what are we going to do for worker absenteeism, as Ellen just walked through? What are some of the control measures we can take and put in place to stop the spread if it in fact hits our community? Social distancing, staggered shifts, working from home, any other options. How are you going to continue essential operations, and how are you going to deal with interrupted supply chains? Next slide, please.
Is this not the right slide?
One more.
Oh, one more. Okay.
Yeah. Again, so the plan should be giving certain recommendations, as I've outlined here, but the overall message is to make sure you're communicating with your employees about the hazards and about the points in the plan. Make sure you're communicating with your employees about the big picture here and how you intend to address the big picture here. And then you can handle the one-off situations as they arise. We've had lots of communications with our clients over the last, couple of weeks that they will call us with the, but what if, And, part of the problem with dealing with those but what ifs as part of your overall plan is that the exceptions begin to swallow your rule. And you spend way too much time focusing on the what ifs and not enough time focusing on your plan and the anticipated hazards and what you can reasonably expect to do. So just keep, an eye on the whole plan. Next slide. So one of the things that OSHA recommends is, all right, what sort of controls can you put in place? The hierarchy of controls from an OSHA perspective is always, engineering controls and administrative controls. There aren't that many engineering controls, especially in this industry, that you can put into place. But there are a variety of administrative controls that you can consider. And again, this is always consider. They don't all work for every workplace. But, again, you go back to minimizing worker contact and modifying schedules and limiting work travel and providing different training. There are a whole bunch of things. Those are just some examples. Next slide, please. One of the things that everyone asks is, all right, well, is there an OSHA standard that applies to COVID-19? The easy answer is no, there's not a specific OSHA standard. There's not even necessarily, certainly not for your industry, an infectious disease sort of standard that applies. There are a few standards out there that are related that you need to keep your eye on. The first one is the personal protective equipment standard. The second one is the bloodborne pathogen standard. Those likely to have more relevance for the healthcare settings than for you folks specifically, but we always like to keep our eye on the general duty clause, which is what we call Section 5A1, and that's your duty to protect employees from quote-unquote recognized hazards in the workplace. COVID-19 would certainly be considered a recognized hazard. That having been said, if you're following the CDC recommendations and local public health department advice, this should normally meet your 5A1 obligations. And so again, we always are advising everyone, keep going back to the touchstone of the CDC and the public health officials. Next slide. And here's one of the last areas I want to touch on with regard to the OSHA guidance is, and this I think is helpful because it gives some practical guidance for employers out there. What they want you to do is they divide the risk here from COVID-19 into different categories of risk depending on who you are, and then they give some advice as to what measures you ought to be considering depending on who you are. So OSHA looks at it first as the very high risk category. If you're a hospital, if you're a morgue, if you're a laboratory worker, that high risk is not really going to apply to you folks. The next, very high risk is not going to apply to you. The next is the high risk. Again, healthcare, medical transport shouldn't apply to you folks. Then the third one is medium risk. Here's where we start to get into areas that may apply to you folks. The medium risk category would include jobs that require frequent or close contact. As Brent said earlier, that's generally considered 6 feet. Contact with people who may be infected. And here's where OSHA starts to spread it out into whether you are in a community spread area or you're not in a community spread area. So if you're in an area that does not have community spread, well, then that really applies to jobs that have frequent contact with people that are coming from, international travelers or any of those high risk zones. If you are in a community spread area, well, now you get into jobs where you're just going to have general close contact with the public. Schools, high density population work, high volume retail work, something that is client-facing. You folks may have some folks that would fall into that category.
Reporters in the field.
Yeah, reporters in the field, for example. Anyone that's going to have that direct contact with the public may fall into this category, especially if you've got a community spread going on out there. And then the last category is low risk. And those are jobs that don't require contact with known or suspected cases or close contact with the general public. And then again, especially if you're not in a community spread area, you would be in a very low risk. Next slide, please. So let's talk about what they're recommending in terms of controls for medium risk and high risk. For low risk, medium risk and low risk. For low risk, which I think most of your jobs would be, OSHA is not recommending any engineering controls. From an administrative controls perspective, they're saying monitor the public health recommendations and communicate with your employees about all the CDC recommendations and monitor your workforce. They're not recommending any specific PPE. Next slide, please. For employees with medium risk, they're recommending that you take a look and see if there are any appropriate engineering controls that you might be able to establish. For administrative controls, again, we're monitoring our employees. If you've got an employee who you believe to be ill, you can offer them a mask. As Brent said earlier, CDC is not recommending masks for healthy employees. And as Ellen touched on earlier, inform customers, vendors, visitors to your facility whether or not they have signs and symptoms, and ask them not to enter the facility. And otherwise, where appropriate, limit contacts with the public. You can consider PPE if that's appropriate, but that would be really facility and situation specific. Next slide. Brent, do you want to touch on anything else?
No, that was good, Jim. Let's see what questions we get.
Patty, if we want to jump to questions, because I know we're running out of time here.
Sure. On the last bit, 2 questions. Do we know how long the virus can live on the newspapers we are sending out? And the second question was, what should we require from our employees who go out to meetings and other events? So to cover meetings and things like that.
Sure. I'll take the newspaper because that's a surface contact issue. Of course, we're dealing with COVID-19, which is a novel virus and has not been around that long, but hasn't been fully tested. The good thing about viruses in this respect is viruses generally do not last very long outside the body. The CDC earlier this week said that in its lab, trying to keep the virus alive, the intent was to keep it alive, under the best conditions they could create was 26 hours. Now that was perfect conditions. There's been another, and I don't think it's a CDC study that came out this week that suggested the virus might live outside the body for up to 3 days. The CDC, which we're generally finding to be most authoritative, encapsulates it down and said it likely survives only a matter of hours. And its survivability is greatly different between a hard surface and a quote unquote a softer surface. The newspaper would not be a hard surface. And so while there's no study yet, it likely is not going to survive on a newspaper very long, probably a matter of a couple hours at most. But again, that's the best information we have at the moment. There's another layer to that question that most people haven't really talked about, which is even though it can survive, is it infectious? And its rate of an ability to create infection outside the body is usually lesser as you get closer to its survivability time frame. So in other words, it might still be detected, but you couldn't get sick from it. And so that's yet another way of shaving down the concern about surfaces and cleaning, and of course your specific one about, from the press room on out.
Would a plastic bag what kind of surface would a plastic bag be considered, since newspapers are bags sometimes? Getting very technical, sorry.
No, it's going to be an in-betweener here. Because it's not a hard surface, and generally when they do the testing, it's a hard, like metallic, hard plastic, and for some reason it just survives this. To give you an example, we all travel on planes from time to time. The CDC says on a soft fabric seat, it's likely not surviving more than a couple minutes. So when you really start to get down into this level, it really depends about what we're talking about. But I apologize, that's about the best I can do, but I hope it's somewhat comforting.
Since you mentioned the word airplane, this is a question that popped up a long time ago, and I've got a lot of questions. I'm trying to, pick and choose a little bit so I can help the most people. We were talking about cruise ships and things like that. I have two questions, but one question was, what about people that have been on an airplane? This question came in with regards to, we were talking people who'd been on cruises. The question was, what about people that have been on an airplane?
Yeah, and so I think that the quick answer, again, we go back to the CDC guidelines, we go back to, what the WHO is telling everyone, and unless you're traveling from one of those level 2 or level 3 areas, there's no recommendation that individual needs to be quarantined or otherwise monitored, unless we learn at some point that there was someone on the plane that had COVID-19. And then yes. But the backdrop to this is that with regard to the plan that we should all have in place and the communications we're having with our employees, is everyone right now should be generally monitoring themselves for signs and symptoms. And if you spike a fever, if you find your shortness of breath, then you should be taking yourself out of the general population and contacting your doctor. So if you were on a flight and you then thereafter, the next day or two, found yourself coughing and, with 100, 101 temperature, you need, whether you got it from that flight or not, you should be calling in sick to work and discussing with your healthcare professional, possibly getting tested to see if you've got it before you return to work.
I'll add one piece of information here. We're still early enough in the United States on this that these cases become known because they get tested by a healthcare professional. The entire public healthcare apparatus gets invoked. And part of what happens is for each positive COVID case, they begin an investigation and they attempt to track down where has that person been, where have they gone, where have they come from. And so information along the lines that Jim was talking about, whether there was a person on your flight, as you probably read in the press, that has been discovered, and then that is part of what people get tracked down. There are people who get contacted and said you were in a facility with a person who was positive for COVID-19. What they recommend that person do is monitor for 24 hours. So they're not like saying, oh yeah, just because you may have been in contact with someone, potentially, once you get a couple rings out from in contact with, even the public health authorities are suggesting just very practical, limited duration stuff.
Okay, I've got two more questions that are regarding travel. I'm going to throw them both kind of related. The first is, if we have employees who have decided to travel out of state this week to a crowded city in a state that has been declared a state of emergency, then we actually consider self-quarantine when they return, specifically because we have a high-risk employee and or employees who have family members at home that would be considered high risk if they contracted the disease.
Okay. I think you're going to default back to the traditional CDC analysis about whether they have been in close contact with a COVID-19 patient. The back end of the question is, I get it, because I actually have an immune compromised daughter and we're dealing with this personally, but the front end of the analysis remains the same, which is you're going to look to see if they've been in contact with, and Jim, I'll let you comment on community, if they've been in a community spread area. Does that give any nuance to the analysis?
Yeah, well, I'd obviously increase the hypothetical potential, but if you don't know that they've been in contact with someone who is a confirmed case, that really seems to be the tipping point, at least from the CDC and OSHA, as to whether or not you're going to, whether or not they're recommending, I will say, that that person not return to the workplace.
Yeah.
Now, can you still do that?
Yeah.
Because you think it's a best practice? You could choose to do that, and that's one of those one-off sort of situations where you learn of that, and now you try and deal with that as best as you can, and handle that kind of, as a sidebar to your overall plan.
Here's an interesting question. If we know we have an employee with various health conditions and this employee refuses to work from home,
well, look, this is where I'm going to be a little bit hard, because it's your workplace, and you're entitled to take reasonable measures. And frankly, under OSHA, we wrap ourselves in the flag here a bit and say, I can't allow you to put someone at risk if I think you're going to expose others in the workplace. And again, what's unsaid as part of that question is, what is it? Are they COVID-19-like symptoms? But I'm presuming that. But you get to decide, and frankly have the obligation on behalf of your workforce to make sure it's a safe place to work. And
I think the question is backwards. I think the question is that they have someone, we'll say, has a compromised immune system or has various health conditions, and that person, to remain safe, doesn't want to work, refuses to work from home. They want to come to work. I believe the question is asking, can we require a doctor's note saying that he is safe to remain in the workplace? So this is someone who's got I assume they mean a compromised system of some sort, who has various health conditions.
Sure. Well, very interesting question.
Yeah. Kind of.
Way down in the weeds.
It's way down there, but it's hard for me to perceive how they would make the argument that the workplace is less risky to them than their home environment that they control. So in other words, it's kind of like mold in and out of one's home versus workplace.
And I think part of the analysis is geographically, where is this workplace? Is this in a community spread area, or is your facility a facility where?
Okay, sorry, I lost you for a second.
No, that's fine. Is your facility a facility where you've had a confirmed COVID case, or you've had, you've got spread in the community? So now you've got that level of heightened awareness, or is this somewhere that is much more remote and you haven't had any of that, and so it's much more of a, do we need to be taking these measures? So I would, that's definitely a part of the analysis. And then, one of the things Ellen was touching on before is just making sure we're consistent in how we're applying our policies.
Yeah. That may be one we have to take offline, Patty.
Yeah, okay.
That's one of those what ifs.
Yeah. So this came in earlier, I'm sorry, when we were talking about cruises, but staying on the cruise theme, what responsibility does the company have if an employee is willingly going on a cruise, having been explained the risks, and comes back afterwards not knowing if they have it but may have been exposed? Do we send the person home with pay? The follow-up statement or question is, in other words, can you tell the essential employee they can't go on the cruise?
Yeah, so I don't think that you can tell someone that they can't go on a cruise. But I do think that, and again, you need to, that's a very general and broad sort of statement. What's the cruise? Where's the cruise? What are the specific circumstances? That having been said, if we've got any sort of indication, we can discourage our employees from going to certain geographic regions, and we can tell our employees that if you're going to a region where there is, community spread, there's a level 2 or level 3 country, that, if you're doing so voluntarily, when you come back, you're not allowed back in the workplace for 2 weeks.
Yeah, you're going to have to self-quarantine.
Okay, here is another interesting question, might be for Ellen. If kids' schools are closed and parents need to work at home to be there for them, is that covered under family leave?
I apologize, Ellen had to leave us at the top of the hour,
okay,
all of 60 seconds ago. I'll make sure that we get that back to you so you can post that. Okay, Patty?
Sure, great, thank you. Let me see. I'm sorry, there's so many questions. What if someone self-treats at home and never goes to a medical center for a test? How would they get a note? How long does the virus stay in the system? Thanks.
I think that Brent was touching on this earlier, and frankly, I think this is going to play out more often than we realize, because I think there are a whole bunch of mild cases of coronavirus out there that are exceedingly similar to the flu or a cold or whatever it may be, and people are not going, frankly, to go to the doctor because they're just, they feel bad for a few days and then they figure it out. But is this consistent with the same, what you were talking about before in terms of return to work?
Yeah, that's where the 14-day quarantine, quote unquote quarantine, is believed to be effective start to finish. So that's the, if you believe you've been exposed or you were known exposed to a COVID patient on day 1 and then you started quarantining, it is believed, according to the CDC at this point, that at 14 days you will have gone through the cycle. Whether you got a mild case, almost asymptomatic, they call it asymptomatic case. So I think that's when it's going to play out. The doctor's note on the back end, I understand. I think what you should try to do is enforce a general policy. And frankly, if you've got somebody who's refusing, I would take that offline and analyze that case separately under the very specific fact pattern there. Because I can envision a scenario amongst us that you might accept a return absent the lack of a note, but I wouldn't do that without some consultation with your own counsel. So.
Yeah, that's a situation that my son, he's 29. He went out of town to Nashville. He was at a soccer game. He came back 3 days later. He had a cold. He called into work, but then work said, no, you need to work from home. You can't come back until you get his doctor's note. He went, got an appointment. They checked him out. He got approval to go back to work. So it was not, I mean, he didn't have anything. He just had a cold. So, but they have, I understand they have certain things that they have to look for and ask and do to make that assessment. So.
Exactly. You got it, Patty.
Okay. So the last question I'm going to throw out here, kind of on one of the screens, it mentioned that we should restrict the public access to the building. Is it time to stop walk-in traffic to our offices where practical? There could be a revenue impact, but if CDC recommends it, it seems like we should do it.
So again, yes, so this is if you get into a community spread situation, and it makes sense to start limiting that. And part of your overall plan ought to be, the economics of your business. And all right, if we're not able to, or it's no longer wise to have public access to our facility, what are our different options that we can put into place in the short term as we're dealing with this issue to get, work around that? Can we do telecommuting? Can we do conference calls? Can we do video calls? Can we use technology in a way that allows us to communicate with our customers and our vendors without direct contact, or without directly allowing them to back and forth in our facility to go to people's offices? There's lots of ways out there these days to limit that. And you may, at the end of the day, you may just decide that it's best, all right, for these, sorts of vendors or these sorts of things, but, there's others that we think we can control in a way that it makes sense to still allow them some access to the facility. What OSHA is really looking for is a thoughtful analysis of the best way to control that risk and the best way to control that spread while still operating your business.
Exactly.
Right.
A number of clients have conference rooms up towards the front of their office space, which if you begin to dramatically limit and refine those contacts that you're going to allow, they're using those. They're kind of doing it on a priority basis, using an office or a conference room right up front, so that just geographically limits the amount of time somebody's walking through your space and how far deep they're going into your space. Again, as Jim said, just, you rethink and come up with a plan, and you will generally be okay. Hopefully all of these measures coupled together will get us through this to what you probably heard is flatten the curve.
Yep.
On the virus.
And all of these should be, viewed hopefully largely as relatively short-term measures as the medical community gets their hands around this over the next 12 months or so, and hopefully a vaccine is developed, and then this will work its way into the system in the same sense that the flu has worked its way into the system, and we'll be able to treat it accordingly. But there is certainly some short-term.
Oops, sorry. You guys there?
Oh.
Yep, we're good.
Okay. So first off, I got a couple of announcements. But first off, I want to say thank you so much, all of you, and Brent and Jamie, and please pass along to Ellen and Camille. We, America's Newspapers, appreciates that you were so willing to jump into this quicksand pit. Because this is tough. This is really tough, right? And I really appreciate your expertise. This is, a novel virus, and I think, it's hard. And I appreciate that you were able to take this on for us and help us with some solid information, some thoughtful information, some reasonable, explanations. So we can't thank you enough. I truly appreciate it. I have a few more questions that that I'll go through. I have a copy of all the questions. So I might send you guys a few of those, and we can answer them and post them to our attendees. Would that be all right?
Of course. Yeah, we're happy to help.
Okay. And folks, for those of you on the webinar, thank you so much for hanging in there. I hope you found it to be of value. A few things I want to remind you about. Number one, yes, you are going to get a copy of the PowerPoint. We are going to also point you to America's Newspapers website, where you will get additional resources that Seyfarth is providing for us. There are, FAQs, some other guidelines, some white papers, etc., that may be of help to you. Lastly, we are working on 3 additional webinars that we hope to get out in the next 7 days or so, maybe 10 days. We're looking at presenting a webinar on the nuances of having to do temporary or remote work environment, how you deal with that. Some companies spend a year transitioning to work from home, so it's not something you can just send people home. I know it's challenging. We're going to try to address that issue. We're hoping to have a best practices, some folks on a call that will be just discussing best practices. And we're also having a webinar who can help your advertising salespeople, your ad departments, so that they may in turn help their customers in the community. How do we handle, the economics of this, and what can we do? So those are 3 additional webinars we're working on. You'll all be the first to know about them, and we will get them out to you as soon as possible. We're trying to move as fast as we can to help. So thank you all for participating. Thanks for tuning in to America's Newspapers. Seyfarth friends, thank you so much. Again, I really can't thank you enough. We appreciate you so much.
Happy to help.
Okay, everybody stay safe, be healthy, wash your hands. Have a great day.
Thank you, Patty.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.